The heavy wooden doors of the courthouse swung open, revealing a room packed with spectators, journalists scribbling furiously, and an air thick with anticipation. The morning sun slanted through the high windows, casting sharp streaks of light across the polished floor, highlighting the tension crackling in the air. At the defense table sat Darius Cole, his dark skin catching the artificial glow of the overhead lights. His broad shoulders squared, his posture straight as if sculpted from stone. He wore a navy blue suit, crisp and understated, but the quiet strength in his sharp eyes set him apart. He was not a man who broke easily. Across from him, at the plaintiff's table, sat Officer James Whitaker, his police uniform neatly pressed, his badge gleaming. His face bore the arrogance of a man who had never had to second-guess his authority. He lounged back in his chair, exuding confidence, the confidence of someone who had played this game before and expected to win. The bailiff stepped forward, voice booming through the high ceilings. State of California versus Darius Cole. Darius rose slowly, controlled, his movements precise. The murmurs in the room swelled as people leaned forward, eager to witness the high-profile case unfold. Judge Leonard Grayson, a seasoned man with thinning gray hair, entered the courtroom. His face betrayed the exhaustion of years spent presiding over cases that blurred into one another. But this one was different. The prosecution was ready. The defense was ready. The stage was set. The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed man named Elliot Barnes, wasted no time. He turned to Officer Whitaker, his voice steady, rehearsed. "Officer Whitaker, can you recount the events of the night in question?" Whitaker nodded, his voice smooth and unwavering. "I was responding to a disturbance call on the east side of town when I spotted the defendant loitering outside a closed business. When I approached and asked him to identify himself, he immediately became hostile. He raised his voice, refused to comply, and when I attempted to de-escalate, he physically assaulted me." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Darius, sitting at the defense table, did not react. His fingers remained interlocked, his expression unreadable. The officer continued, feigning a pained expression. "He struck me in the chest and made a grab for my weapon. At that point, I had no choice but to restrain him." A hush fell over the room. The weight of his words, the severity of the accusations, painted a damning picture. Judge Grayson nodded. "Thank you, Officer Whitaker. You may step down." Darius's lawyer, Marcus Reed, a young, determined attorney with a fire in his eyes, stood hesitantly. He flipped through his notes, glancing at Darius for reassurance, but the man beside him remained as still as a mountain. "Your Honor," Marcus began, voice slightly strained, "we are prepared to proceed." Judge Grayson gestured for him to continue. Marcus turned toward the jury, inhaled deeply, and then motioned toward the witness stand. "The defense calls Darius Cole to testify." A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. Darius stood. He buttoned his suit jacket with deliberate precision and walked toward the stand, his movements calculated, powerful. He took his seat. The room stilled. "Mr. Cole," Marcus began, his voice gaining strength, "can you explain, in your own words, what happened that night?" Darius leaned forward slightly, his deep voice carrying through the silence. "I can. But first, let's be clear about one thing." He turned his gaze toward Whitaker, locking eyes with him. "The officer's account is not just inaccurate, it's a lie." Gasps filled the room. The prosecutor smirked. "A bold claim, Mr. Cole. Do you have any proof to back it up?" Darius met his gaze, unwavering. "I believe the truth has a way of revealing itself." Judge Grayson cleared his throat. "Proceed, Mr. Cole." Darius sat back, his voice steady. "That night, I was heading home from a friend's place. I stopped to check my phone for directions when Officer Whitaker approached me. He didn't ask if I needed help. He didn't explain why he was questioning me. He just demanded my ID, flashlight in my face, tone sharp. I asked why. The prosecutor pounced. "So, you questioned his authority?" Darius tilted his head. "No, I questioned his motive." "There's a difference." A murmur ran through the courtroom. "And what happened next?" Marcus asked. When I asked why, his tone shifted. He raised his voice, told me to stop playing games and just do what I was told. When I asked if I had done anything wrong, he grabbed my arm. Another ripple of whispers. "Are you claiming the officer physically restrained you without cause?" "Yes," Darius said simply. "And when I told him to let go, he tightened his grip." And then he said something I won't forget. He turned, locking eyes with Whitaker again. He said, "Men like you don't get to ask questions." The courtroom erupted into a frenzy. Judge Grayson pounded his gavel. "Order. Order in the court." The prosecutor forced a tight smile. "Mr. Cole, do you have any evidence of this?" Darius exhaled softly, his voice eerily calm. "I don't. But someone else does." He turned slightly as Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a USB drive. "Your Honor, the defense submits video evidence, recorded by a witness." The courtroom stilled. The judge gestured for the bailiff to take the drive. Moments later, the screen flickered to life. The shaky footage played. The angle was partial, taken from behind a car, but the audio was crystal clear. Officer Whitaker's voice rang out. "Men like you don't get to ask questions." The gasps were deafening. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Judge Grayson banged his gavel furiously. "I will have order in this court." Across the room, Whitaker's confident smirk had vanished. His jaw clenched, his fingers fidgeting. Darius sat silently, his expression unreadable. The walls were starting to crack. And soon, they would crumble. The courtroom was a thunderstorm of whispers and murmurs. The weight of the video evidence pressed down like an anvil. Judge Grayson exhaled, rubbing his temples before turning to the prosecutor. "Mr. Barnes, do you have an explanation for this?" Prosecutor Elliot Barnes adjusted his tie, his confidence visibly shaken. He turned to Officer Whitaker, who was staring at the screen, his pale complexion betraying the panic he tried to hide. "Officer Whitaker," Barnes said, his voice tighter than before, "is there an explanation for this footage?" Whitaker swallowed. His jaw clenched. "It's taken out of context," he muttered. "Out of context." Marcus Reed stepped forward, his voice controlled but carrying a dangerous edge. "Because what we all just heard was crystal clear." Darius sat still, his presence a force of gravity at the defense table. He didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to smirk. The truth was already doing the damage for him. "Your Honor," Marcus continued, "this footage contradicts every single word Officer Whitaker has said under oath. And that's not all." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out another file. "We have records," he said, handing them to the bailiff, "that show Officer Whitaker has been the subject of multiple complaints. Excessive force, racial profiling, abuse of power. None of them have ever resulted in disciplinary action. Until now." The jury members leaned forward, flipping through the documents. The gallery erupted into more whispers. Even the judge's expression darkened. Whitaker's fingers twitched on the table. The walls weren't just cracking. They were collapsing. Marcus turned back to Darius. "Mr. Cole, there's one last thing I'd like you to share with the court." Darius met his lawyer's gaze and nodded. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and stood. His movements were slow, deliberate. He walked back to the witness stand, and as he settled in, he turned his full attention to the jury. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, powerful. "For the last few days, you've been told that I'm just another man who caused trouble for the police. That I got aggressive. That I was a threat." He let the words settle before continuing. "But the truth is, I spent 22 years serving this country. I led men into battle. I made decisions under pressure that most people will never have to face. And I lived by a code of honor, discipline, and integrity. A beat of silence. That's because I was a U.S. Army Ranger. Lieutenant Colonel. Retired." The room froze. Gasps. Stunned silence. Even the judge blinked, as if processing what had just been said. Marcus stepped closer. "So let me ask you this, Officer Whitaker. Do you really think a decorated Army Ranger, trained to remain calm in high-pressure situations, would suddenly lose his composure over a simple ID request?" Whitaker didn't answer, because there was no answer. The courtroom was still, the jury staring at Darius like they were seeing him for the first time. Then Darius turned to them, his voice quieter now, but no less powerful. "That night, I wasn't a threat. I wasn't breaking any laws. I wasn't a criminal. I was just a man trying to go home." He turned to Judge Grayson. "And for that, I was treated like I didn't belong." The judge said nothing. Because what could he say? The truth was undeniable. The jury didn't deliberate for long. When they returned, the tension in the room was thick. The forewoman, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority, stood. She cleared her throat, unfolding the verdict slip with steady hands. "In the case of the state versus Darius Cole, we find the defendant not guilty on all charges." A collective exhale. A murmur of relief. A quiet cheer from the gallery. But the forewoman wasn't done. She looked at the judge. Furthermore, we strongly recommend an internal investigation into Officer Whitaker's conduct, as well as the practices of the department that allowed this to happen. Judge Grayson nodded, his expression unreadable. The court acknowledges this recommendation and will act accordingly. Whitaker's hands clenched into fists. His world was falling apart in front of him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Darius, for the first time, allowed himself a small smile. Not of victory, but of justice finally being served. As the court adjourned, the whispers turned into conversation, and the conversation turned into something larger, something unstoppable. The cool evening air wrapped around Darius as he stood on the courthouse steps, the echoes of the trial still ringing in his ears. The weight that had been pressing on his chest for months had lifted, but not completely. Justice had been served today, but his battle was far from over. A swarm of reporters rushed forward, their cameras flashing like lightning against the darkening sky. Microphones were shoved in his direction, voices overlapping with urgent questions. Mr. Cole, how do you feel about the verdict? What does this mean for police accountability? Do you plan to press charges against Officer Whitaker? Darius let out a slow breath, steadying himself before stepping forward. His lawyer, Marcus, gave him a slight nod of encouragement. This wasn't just my fight, Darius said, his deep voice carrying over the noise. This was a fight for every man, every woman, every person who has ever been falsely accused, mistreated, or silenced by a system that is supposed to protect them. The crowd hushed slightly. What happened to me wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern that has existed for too long, allowed to grow unchecked. Today, that pattern cracked, but it hasn't broken yet. One reporter raised her hand. What do you mean, Mr. Cole? Darius glanced at Marcus, who stepped forward. Officer Whitaker may have been exposed, but he wasn't working alone. The system protected him. It ignored complaints. It buried evidence. And until that changes, people like him will continue to abuse their power. Another reporter shouted from the back. So what happens next? What are you going to do? Darius straightened. We hold them accountable. The words were simple, direct, but they carried the weight of a promise. As the cameras flashed, Darius turned away, leaving behind the courthouse that had once felt like a battlefield. The war wasn't over, but he had won this battle. And now, it was time for the next fight. The fallout from the trial rippled through the city like an earthquake. At first, it started with whispers, quiet conversations in coffee shops, in barbershops, in City Hall. Then the whispers turned into demands. Community leaders called for investigations. Protesters gathered outside the police department, holding signs that read, "Justice for all, not just some." And then, the real storm hit. 2 weeks after the trial, an independent review board released a damning report on Officer Whitaker's history. The headlines blazed across every major news outlet. Officer James Whitaker dismissed amid evidence of racial profiling and abuse. Cover up in the force? New reports show pattern of excessive force ignored for years. Falsified reports, missing body camera footage. How many more were there? Whitaker's past had been carefully buried, until now. Darius sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through the news articles, his fingers gripping his coffee mug a little too tightly. They're finally listening, Marcus said, sitting across from him, tapping his phone against the table. But you know this isn't over. Darius nodded, exhaling through his nose. They'll try to sweep it under the rug again. Make Whitaker the scapegoat and pretend the problem stops with him. Marcus leaned forward. Then we make sure they can't. He pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Complaints against other officers. People who were silenced. Cases that were ignored. Darius flipped through the pages. Names. Dates. Testimonies. This isn't just about Whitaker, Marcus continued. He wasn't the only one. Darius closed the folder and looked up. His expression was unreadable, but his mind was made up. Then let's make sure no one else gets away with it. The police union pushed back, hard. Officer Whitaker was a good cop. He made a mistake, but this witch hunt is out of control, their spokesman declared in an emergency press conference. The police chief gave a carefully worded statement. We take these accusations seriously, but we also stand by the men and women who risk their lives to protect this city. They were trying to control the damage, but the public wasn't buying it. More stories surfaced. More victims came forward. Darius found himself at the center of something bigger than he ever expected. Interviews, rallies, policy meetings. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for justice on a scale he never imagined. And then, the threat started. A note left on his car. Walk away. A phone call in the middle of the night. Silence on the other end. He knew what it meant. But Darius Cole wasn't a man who backed down. The world had underestimated him once. It wouldn't make that mistake again. Months passed. Investigations grew. And then, the hammer finally dropped. A grand jury indictment was announced, not just against Whitaker, but against 4 other officers who had falsified reports, used excessive force, and covered for each other. The city held its breath as the police department scrambled for damage control. Internal policies changed. A new oversight committee was formed. Darius watched from a distance, standing outside City Hall as the mayor gave a press conference. Marcus stood beside him. "We did it," Marcus said. Darius nodded, but his expression remained serious. "We started it." Because justice wasn't just about one case. It was about changing a system. And that fight would never be over. Months later, Darius stood in front of a room full of young men and women, activists, law students, veterans. Change doesn't come easy, he told them. But it comes when good people refuse to be silent. He looked out over the crowd. He saw future leaders, future warriors for justice. And he knew this was the real victory. Because his fight had sparked something bigger. And the truth? The truth would never be silenced again. This wasn't just a story about one man. It was about a system that needed to be held accountable. A system that, for too long, relied on silence to survive. But silence was no longer an option. Because when people stand up for justice, change is inevitable.